Sticking with state politics, in a groundbreaking move, State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman and Comptroller Tom DiNapoli are teaming up to take on government corruption both in Albany and across the state. Now, as Attorney General, Schneiderman does not have criminal jurisdiction to investigate public integrity cases, but the Comptroller does have that power when it comes to the misuse of taxpayer money. So DiNapoli and Schneiderman are actually maximizing their collective powers by establishing a joint task force to probe a variety of potential crimes from pension padding to abuse of pork barrel spending. Any findings by that task force will be referred to the AG's office for criminal prosecution. This move is being viewed by some as a little bit of a tweak to Governor Andrew Cuomo. As Attorney General, Cuomo tried to get the powers of his office expanded to probe public corruption. He was rebuffed by the legislature. Now, as governor, Cuomo has the power to grant Schneiderman subpoena power, but he has not done so. Joining me to talk more about this is one person who has a lot of experience dealing with public integrity cases. Mark Peters is a member of the Commission on Public Integrity. He also served as the head of Eliot Spitzer's Public Integrity Unit in the AG's office from 2001 to 2004. Mark, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be here.
Okay. So it's a little complex. I tried to break it down as best I could, but essentially this is a pretty unusual occurrence. Could you just explain to us how it would work?
Sure. Executive Law Section 63(3) essentially says that a variety of state officials, the governor, the comptroller, various commissioners, may authorize the Attorney General to bring criminal cases in areas that affect their respective regulatory regimes. Right. So the comptroller, whenever we're dealing with fiscal matters, has the right to send what's called a referral letter to the Attorney General. When he does that, the Attorney General suddenly assumes the ability to bring criminal prosecutions in that area subject to what's going on. Now, in the past, the governor and various state officials, including the comptroller, have made individual referrals to the Attorney General. In fact, when I was head of the Public Integrity Unit under Eliot Spitzer, one of the big cases that I did was one that was originally brought to us by the Comptroller's office. Their auditors had found a bunch of irregularities in the way the state paid for security guards. It turned out to be a much bigger deal, and they ended up sending over to us a referral letter, and then we collectively brought the case. What I think is interesting and important about what's happening now is that instead of doing this on a case-by-case basis, waiting for things to pop up, the Comptroller and the Attorney General have gotten together and decided to do this systematically. So that instead of the Comptroller looking at something, seeing a problem in a particular area, and then saying to the AG, will you prosecute, they're doing this together as a collaboration across a whole spectrum of issues.
You know, what's interesting also, and I think that it's hard for most people, including me, to understand, is that the Attorney General, who's supposed to be the top attorney of the state, doesn't actually have jurisdiction or power to go after some of this stuff. So what you see is instead individual district attorneys going after things like, I don't know, Alan Hevesy, the initial charges against him, which we knew as Chauffeurgate, for example, which was the misuse of a public employee as a driver for his wife. I mean, there have been a variety of efforts to expand the powers of the office, and yet it's never worked. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, and you're absolutely right, by the way. The Attorney General's got very limited criminal jurisdiction. What this is going to do is substantially expand the powers of the Attorney General's office to bring these kinds of criminal cases. The neat thing about this is, of course, that they're not going to have legislative approval. Right. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the things that are being done in the legislature aren't still necessary. You know, the governor's push for ethics reform is every bit as necessary today as it was yesterday before this was announced. This just adds another tool from the existing toolbox. And I think that that's very, very important, because in the past there have been attempts to get the legislature to make changes. That hasn't really happened. There's never been an attempt to do this in this sort of collaborative way. And I think it's going to be very important. It's taking some tools that exist and using them to their maximum effect right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree it makes sense just from a logical standpoint that you don't, when you ask the legislature, hey, I'd like more power so I can come after you guys, it's a little bit difficult to understand why they would say yes. You bring up an interesting point, though. This comes at a time in Albany when the governor is pretty much locked in negotiations with the legislature over ethics reform. One of the big points of the ethics reform bill that we have yet to see, although we've heard a lot about, is disclosure of outside income. This has nothing to do with that, correct?
Well, yes and no. It could. And in fact, in some ways, I think this will ultimately end up helping the governor's negotiating position and helping the governor get what he wants. Technically, these referrals are all about spending state money. But what you have to remember is that under the law, once the Attorney General has a referral to look into a particular matter, he's then allowed to follow that to everything else that relates to it. So that if he starts out by investigating, for example, member item money that went to a charity, he can then follow that up to see what else the charity is doing. And if that charity is somehow funneling money to a legislator who's also getting paid to help that charity, then suddenly all of that gets swept in from the initial referral, as long as each one was a logical step of the next.
So could potentially be very bad for the legislature, for example. The thing is, as I mentioned in the introduction, the governor, and you also mentioned yourself, has in the past, different governors have referred cases to attorneys general. And also, when he was attorney general, Andrew Cuomo said specifically to the legislature, hey, I'd like to have subpoena power, actually, in public corruption cases, and he didn't get it. He has not referred anything to Attorney General Schneiderman. I mean, it looks like a turf war. Do you think that might be possible?
Well, look, I'm certainly not, I'm not the one to talk about Albany politics. I'm a former prosecutor, not a former politician. But I don't see this as a turf war, because in fact, I think this is one of these win-win situations. The Attorney General and the Comptroller have come up with a great idea that will let them collectively be much more efficient about policing the way in which public funds get spent. So it's a win for the Attorney General and it's a win for the Comptroller. But my guess is that a lot of what they find is going to strengthen the governor's hand in seeking the ethics reform that he wants. So that I think in the end the governor will be a beneficiary, because as the Attorney General and the Comptroller begin to find things, and believe me, they're going to, that's going to give the governor more ammunition. It's going to cause more public outcry for ethics reform. So I think it strengthens the governor's hand.
Now,
so far from being a turf war, I see this as helping everybody.
Right. I mean, in the end, it's true that we have seen a variety of different cases for all sorts of things, from Alan Hevesi to former Senator Vincent Leibel, to now an investigation of State Senator Shirley Huntley, all sorts of things in the mix that make an argument that good government advocates in particular say, look, this is an argument for ethics. We keep beating the drum on it and nothing's happening. You're going to have to say something, because clearly polls show that New Yorkers are quite upset about it. What is your thought about the Moreland Act and how effective that may be? The governor has said he might use the Moreland Act if he doesn't get an ethics reform deal from the legislature to investigate the legislature. This is another kind of thing that exists to empower the governor. Is it in fact able to be used to investigate individual members of the legislature legally?
Look, if the governor impanels a Moreland Commission, it has the ability to do these investigations. And again, and this sort of goes back to something I said, what happens when you do these kinds of prosecutions is invariably your jurisdiction expands as you find things, because there's lots of law out there that says that prosecutors get to logically follow the trail of what they're looking at. So that, again, even things that don't start out with very, very broad jurisdiction can end up with that broader jurisdiction, the ability to investigate individual legislators, if what you find in your first go-round logically leads you to take that next step there. And so, yes, the governor could end up with a Moreland Commission that could do these things. And clearly one of the issues the legislature's now got to deal with is, do they pass ethics reform, or do they see what happens with a Moreland Commission? Well,
do you believe that it would, in fact, touch off a legal fight? Because there's been some suggestion that the legislature would say, okay, we see your Moreland Act Commission, and we raise you a challenge in the courts over whether you actually have the power to use it to come after us.
Well, Do I think the legislature will bring that kind of, look, almost anybody with the ability to hire a lawyer can bring a lawsuit and challenge government action.
Sure.
I think at the end of the day, it's not, if I had to bet, and betting on what courts do is often a bad business, but if I had to guess, I would guess at the end of the day the courts would allow the governor to do this. They might put some limits on the jurisdiction, but again, as I said, what happens is, as long as the courts let him do create a Moreland Commission and do some of the investigations, as you find things, it's harder and harder for courts to say, okay, but you can't take that investigation to the next step. What often happens is courts say, fine, you can have the Moreland Commission, we're giving you somewhat circumscribed jurisdiction, but when that jurisdiction yields stuff, the courts tend to let you take the next step.
Well,
again, similarly with what's going on here, the AG and the controller have taken a very important, I think, bold first step in using tools at their disposal. And as they find things, their jurisdiction is going to expand. The courts will let them go further.
Well, we will see what they turn up. I want to thank you very much, Mark, for joining us. It's good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.